Hey guys, it's Will with Terrible Infant, and you are watching Super Underrated. This is a new segment we're doing in which we being me, and at some point probably Mike and our friend Logan, and everyone else who you've seen in these videos, will talk about movies that we believe are super underrated. Ta-da! It's pretty easy to understand. So for the first episode, I'm going to talk about a movie that I really, really love. I actually put it on my favorite films of the decade list, which I did on my Will Terrible Instagram account, and it's a film that has, I think its Rotten Tomatoes rating is like 30% or somewhere thereabouts. It was released in 2015. The film is Chappie. Here I have this Neil Blomkamp. Blomkamp. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but this is actually his first three films, Blu-ray box set. So District 9, Elysium, Chappie, and then it has like concept art and notes, like essays and stuff in here. And this was $15 or like $14.99 or something like that. So if you're a fan of his work, this is definitely worth it. So this film stars, and I should say that it was directed by Neil Blomkamp, and it was co-written by him and Terry Tatchell, who I think is his regular co-screenwriter. Like I think they did District 9 and Elysium and Chappie together. Dave Patel is in it. Hugh Jackman, Sigourney Weaver, the members of D. Ontvert, the South African music group. Jose Pablo Cantillo is in it, who I'm not very familiar with him, but he's really good in this movie. I really liked his performance. He's like a very like physical, present performer who has like kind of like a movie star vibe, but he also is very subtle as an actor. And he's a very his character is very loud. So, but the things that he does with the character are really interesting and subtle. So it's this interesting mixture of like he's a very brash character, but his performance has a lot of great subtleties to it. So I'm just looking at my notes here to see. Oh, and Charlotte Copley is in it, who played the main guy in District 9, and he plays the artificial intelligence, like the robot in this film. Basically, does the voice, and I think he may have done motion capture for it too. So, if you're unfamiliar with Chappie, it's about a character played by Dave Patel who helps the police in South Africa develop a robot, basically police robot that goes out on the streets and helps prevent crime, as crime has like kind of gotten out of control. So the film is looking at kind of like the military industrial complex in the same way the District 9 was in a certain way, and contracts between the police and arms manufacturers and stuff like that, and like weapons research, and the way that policing and community relations and stuff like that in these places, militarized police forces is very often driven by arms manufacturers rather than what is best for the community from which the police come, right? And Hugh Jackman's character is ex-military, and he's developing this giant robot. And Dave Patel's smaller robots they're more economically feasible, and like there's a lot of reasons that the police would rather be using those than those. So there's a feud between Dave Patel's character and Hugh Jackman's character, and Sigourney Weaver plays their boss. And what ends up happening is Dave Patel's character develops artificial intelligence. So he steals an old police robot, like a shell of the robot, basically, like there's no intelligence within it. And he puts this AI program into the robot, and it becomes Chappie, this like living thing, right? But he can't keep it because he stole it. So he ends up, I think he gets robbed, if I remember correctly, and he gets kidnapped and robbed or something like that by these criminals who are played by Dee Ontvert, and they they kind of take Chappie from him. So like, oh, this is this indestructible police robot, right? Like we can use it for all this badass stuff. So I'm going to talk. Basically, the structure of this is going to be I'm going to talk very briefly about the climate in which Chappie came out and how I think that may have negatively affected the response to it, and then I'm going to talk about why I think it's a really good movie. So Chappie came out right in and I would say that Chappie and District 9 are equally good movies. And I know that's heresy to some people, but in terms of what they look at in their themes, in terms of their originality, in terms of this really interesting like mixture of like cyberpunk and like gritty kind of like dystopian realism, um, they're very similar films, and I think they're equally as good as one another. But District 9 came out at a time when there was kind of this lull in what summer movies looked like. It was this kind of open space, right? Because the Star Wars trilogy had ended, and like a couple years ago, right? Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy was in between chapters, and then we knew that the final chapter was coming, so that would be the end of that. Then the Marvel movies had only just gotten started, so there wasn't like a single clear dominant force in the summer box office. And then this movie came out. It was really original. Obviously, it had the benefit of being his first film. District 9 came out of nowhere and was a huge hit, and people loved it. And then 5 years later, 6 years later, Chappie comes out, and people really didn't like it. So what changed? Marvel changed. So you go from an environment in which there is no obvious template for what a summer movie should look like to an environment in which every single blockbuster looks exactly the same. And Marvel films are relatively well regarded by film critics, right? And so suddenly you have trained, well, not suddenly, but over the course of 6 years, right? The film industry essentially trained film critics to expect a certain type of summer blockbuster. And when movies require, because Chappie was marketed as pretty much like a sci-fi action movie, right? It didn't come out in the summer, but it was presented as a big studio action film, right, with sci-fi elements to it. So when you're in this environment in which you have expectations for what those films look like, I think film critics, if you read their reviews and you read between the lines and you read the articles they write, essays they write, and their reviews, and you kind of take their whole body of work in tandem, they tend to turn their brains off when they watch movies, in as much as they become so accustomed to watching certain types of films that their criticism of them becomes rote, right? They're reacting to things without really thinking about them and trying to figure out what the filmmaker is trying to do, why the filmmaker is trying to do that. And I find that to be a really irritating tendency on the part of film critics, because if you've never made a movie, right, and I would argue that probably, well, I would suggest that maybe 99% of film critics have never made a film before. Short films don't count in film school, just FYI, in case you're going to try to catch me on a technicality there. Um, if you're not a filmmaker, maybe you should think for a minute about what the filmmaker is trying to do, read some interviews, try to understand the subtext of the film, um, and understand the work in and of itself, rather than as just another summer movie that you have to review, and oh, you didn't like it as much as the Marvel movies because it doesn't present you as clear a narrative or whatever. And again, this is just my conjecture as to why this film did not do as well with critics as District 9. So, another reason I think that this film was not well liked by certain people, and this is a conversation I've actually had with other people to whom I've shown this film who didn't see it when it came out because of the bad reviews it got. And excuse me, this is especially true of parents, and especially parents of young children. This movie is extremely upsetting, and people don't like it when their action movies are upsetting. And when you read the criticisms of this film, they're pretty generic garbage. It's stuff like, oh, this film is about artificial intelligence, but it's not intelligent. It's like, that doesn't mean anything. What specifically do you mean by that? That's just stupid, nonsensical criticism of a film, right? One of the other negative reviews I read said that it had narrative implausibilities, and it's like, I've seen this movie I think 4 or 5 times, right? And as I've said before in these videos, I've spent 6 years of my adult life reading screenplays as an intern and then professionally. I've read thousands of screenplays. I have a graduate degree in screenwriting, and I don't see any narrative gaps or logical problems or implausibilities in this film. So what are you talking about? Right, because they're not citing specific examples. You're just being lazy and you're being a loser. And so, the film critics, but so the point I'm getting at here is that when a movie is upsetting, it upsets you on a fundamental level, and maybe you're not articulating to yourself, I found that movie upsetting and disturbing. You're just coming up with reasons not to like it, right? So, what is disturbing about Chappie? And this is how I start to get into what I really love about this film. Chappie to me is very obviously it's about children, it's about society, it's about the nature of systemic oppression, and it's about kind of nature versus nurture, right? So the Dave Patel character is very kind, very intelligent, very compassionate, and he wants to read books to Chappie. He wants to teach him to be kind and compassionate, intelligent, all these things, right? The characters played by Jose Pablo Cantillo and Ninja of D. Onford are criminals, and they want to use Chappie to commit crimes, right? And so what you're basically doing here is you're exposing a child, because this is a brand new artificial intelligence, right? It doesn't know anything it needs to be taught. You are exposing it to the good side of human nature and the bad side of human nature simultaneously, and you are offering it an option. So, where does the systemic oppression come into play? Chappie is a police robot, right? So he represents systemic oppression and police violence and all these other things, right? So Chappie is hated by the people of, I think it takes place in Johannesburg, for something that he never did, right? Because his intelligence is brand new to him. He is the shell of a police robot, but he is a new living, I don't know if he's a living, whatever you want to call artificial intelligence. He is a new being, right? Like a child is. But he is hated for something that he can't control, which is the shell that he is placed into. So you can really, I mean, if you want to take this really far, you can read this as the body and the soul, right? And so, thinking about the fact that this movie takes place in Johannesburg, right? Apartheid and black Africans versus white Africans, and hating someone for the shell of who they are versus who they actually are, right? And Chappie faces, so Chappie kind of escapes from where he's living with these criminals, or he's thrown out into the world. And people, there's a scene where like these young punks come and they beat him up, and they throw a Molotov cocktail at him, and he goes to them for help and to try to be friendly to him, and they attack him. And then these people who are operating on behalf of the police, trying to get him back into the police force, catch him. And they hate him because he has gotten away, and they want to destroy his intelligence. And they actually cut his, I think, if I remember correctly, spoiler alert, they cut his arm off with a buzzsaw or something like that. So, and this is where this movie gets really upsetting. On the surface, it's just people beating up a robot, right? But the way that Chappie is introduced to you and the childlike nature of Chappie, you look at Chappie as a child, and then Chappie is having his arm cut off and like screaming with this buzzsaw, right? It's very disturbing and upsetting. And and again, as I said with the performance of Jose Pablo Cantillo, this is a very loud, violent, cyberpunky, pulpy movie. And I think because of that, people assume that the whole movie is brash and unsubtle, but there are actually tremendous subtleties to the way that it handles these themes. So I think I've done a decent job of explaining. I'm just looking at my notes here one more time, but that's more or less why I love Chappie and why I think maybe it wasn't given a fair shake, or why people don't like it as much. But I think it's a great movie. Like I said, I think it's just as good as District 9. I really love it. It was actually intended to be part of a trilogy. And then because it didn't make enough money, it became financially inviable to make the other parts of the trilogy. So that's a total bummer. And we missed out on that. But my name is Will. You've been watching Terrible Infant. This show, like I said, this segment, whatever you want to call it, it's called Super Underrated. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.